Thank you very much for coming. Thank you once more. Thank you, Чийто. We are the, as you see, the conference says Archives in Documentary Cinema, or конференция архивите в документалното кино. My name is Robert Tomik Zuber. I will present myself later on because first I have these esteemed ladies who are agreeing to be in this panel and allowing me to be some kind of moderator of it. So firstly I kindly say warm rewards to Dr. Albena Taneva, Associate Professor, Chair of the Sofia University Department of Public Administration. And we have Mridu Chandra, producer, author, Emmy-nominated producer, and a person who has a lot of experience also in using archives in her projects. As I said, my name is Robert Tomik Zuber. I'm also producer and filmmaker from Croatia and host of a program called Dealing with the Past from Sarajevo Film Festival, which also deals with archives in contemporary unfortunate wars in Balkans. So I'm going to start with the film. I have my own impressions, but I think that I'm more here as a moderator than panelist itself. But one of the things when Neda kindly sent me the film to see it in 3 minutes, almost 4 minutes, which is 1 hour and 10 minutes, I said, oh my God, I'm going to be killed. I don't want to see that movie. Then, as I had a prejudice, I show myself that prejudices are something which in creative filmmaking are nicely to be destroyed, as my prejudice was destroyed with this film, because I enjoy this film so much, the creativity and the way only 4 minutes became beautiful, even aesthetical visual film. And then a very important topic, which we can talk about it now. This is my first impression, but Dr. Tana, what was your impression when you saw it?
Well, I feel like saying I'm speechless, which is not a good start for discussion. And I'm so moved. I'll use a word in Bulgarian, настръхнах. And this is not just a documentary film. It is so emotional, and it has so many layers that speak to you, that it brings us opportunities not only for discussions, for reflection, for communication with so many different audiences, with youngsters, with students, with anybody. This is a small item that tells us everything, not only about memory, not only about the memory of Holocaust, but about human nature, about the way every one of us is responsible for any moment of life and direction of this life. And it raises big questions and small, very intimate moments to reflect. So this is the first that I would say.
So I have so many things to say about this film, but many of the things were also said in the film. I feel like I was taken on this journey of discovery, and I felt all of those things. So I'll try to say something unique in terms of what I felt. It speaks so much to me in terms of thinking about how important it is, who is looking, who is the author of the film. In this case, the author of the film was Daniel Kurtz, a Jewish American. It was not a German or a Polish person. So who is looking and who is making the film is so important. It's a conversation we're all having today. But that spoke to me because he filmed this. And the other thing that really spoke to me immediately was that the children wanted to be seen, and even the adults, but more you can see it in the joy of the children jumping into the frame. And that's exactly what is the reason I make films today, is because when I see the power of that desire to be seen, you know, most of my films, we can talk about it later, are about minority communities, and not just racial minority, but gender and identity minority, and bringing them into the main frame. So as we say, history is written by the winners. It's really about bringing someone else into the frame, and that's something I feel I can do as a filmmaker, no matter how hard it is. So we'll talk about that, and you can see it was such a difficult process to bring this information to the main frame, right? But that's so important, and I just felt so inspired in the first 5 minutes when the children, you know, the filmmaker says they wanted to, they jumped into the frame and the filmmaker responded. I'm saying Daniel is the filmmaker, but that he responded and let them take over. But that's, to me, like the brilliance of this story, and then looking for who they are because they didn't want to be erased. It's so ironic.
Well, in a way, what I think that what this film shows, and it's important when we are talking about archives, and that is that every archive can be seen as itself, but this gives us a new perspective, some kind of contextualizing every possible evidence of possible history, especially when we talk about Holocaust. Even so many years after this happened in our humanity, unfortunately, and then you discover this kind of archive, contextualized, and it communicates with today's audience.
This film and many other footages and still pictures and documents recover different segments of history. This particular film actually is based on footages of life. It speaks of catastrophe, because I think Holocaust is a catastrophe of civilization. And it speaks about this memory in a very powerful way. It reminds us that life existed and it could continue if. So it raises questions. But to memorize the life the way it was, with this very focused way on every face, on relationships between these people. And we can see that even 3 minutes could be a whole universe. So archives are such precious institutions. They keep memories, they keep past, and they keep not only very important documents of agreements, of big events that we study in our school programs, in universities as well, but it has thousands of files, of pictures and small pieces of documents that could be so emotional, so important. They keep not only the objective memory of the past, but it keeps it in all colors. I'm really very impressed that you're here. And I'm not sure why you feel like listening to us, so who we are. We have our professions, our expertise, but I myself in this topic entered like years ago. It was 1996, and I started as a researcher. And I spent almost 2 years, literally every day reading in all different archives. So and I'm not a historian, and I realized that, and I'm a sociologist. I realized that reading documents based on concept, looking for recovering particular period in a way it happened, the more you know, the more you understand what else you could do in order to recover. So you read documents, you read letters, diaries, you go through interviews, you read police reports. It's very interesting to read, so to say, memos of secret police guys who followed somebody, and you can learn such details that they bring all colors. And also, as it was said in this film, we went to files of meteorologists to see when somebody says it was cold. So it matters whether it was -2 or 10 degrees, whether it was raining while the deportations happened. And yes, it matters. When we say it was a cold, rainy day on March 4th, 1943, and if something has happened in the night of that particular day so many years ago, it happened to people exactly same as us. They were in their beds at home, and somebody came, knocked on the door, so the big history and our small normal lives meet in one particular moment. And you could put this in a documentary book, you can put this in a, fiction, it could be a documentary film, but we have to preserve this memory in a way that is communicative. It has to reach, my point is, in emotional way to every new generation, so not to inform them, because it is not important to, it is not enough to inform. We could be informed, we could know, and still somebody could say, I don't care, so I know about all that. Why should I go to see one more movie? But this movie, and many more that are dedicated in this way to this past, touches us. It doesn't inform. It speaks of real people emotionally, psychologically, in a very shaking way, and it provokes our reflection, our understanding, to start looking for not answers but for questions. And especially footages of this past are particularly important, and it is very difficult to get them. It happened so that I was executive producer of one documentary movie having nothing to do with cinema, and I realized that in order to have like a couple of minutes of documentary film, you work for many days and months and collecting items that refer to this past, to reconstruct the context in an adequate, in an objective way. So this is a real chance that we meet here, and one of my objectives is always to look for opportunities to keep attention to these artifacts, to these films, to these moments, so to have as many as possible young people, other people, to come and to see.
I mean, one thing which you said now, and that's a big question to you also, is that, and I think it's very important that this heavy topic, we saw films with the archives about concentration camps, what happened in Auschwitz, Treblinka, and we saw those pictures after liberation came. But this, as you said, goes opposite. It puts on the spotlight life, children, join us. And that is heavy contrapunct to what happened to them, and then we hear the witnessing in that room. What do you think of that?
Yeah, it goes back to who's making the film footage, right? So what we saw after the war is the documentation of the regime, which is very, scary and methodical, and this is life and the power of home movies. It also speaks to the time in terms of like what people had in terms of media at that time was newsreel footage, and newsreels are like what is considered news is stories of the powerful and those celebrities, power, international news. Those are the kinds of things the newsreels were telling. Also important, but that's the power of the democratization of media when it happens in many layers. Now we have our own, everybody has a cell phone, everybody has a smartphone, and we can take pictures. But at this time, it was who had the movie camera was limited to a certain number of people, and that slowly came into the hands of the middle class, or anyone first who could afford the camera. And then as we get into modern video cameras, then American, I'm just going to say from my perspective, American families started having these cameras later, you know, in the 60s and the 70s. And then you start documenting this kind of life. So I'm interested in, you know, as a filmmaker, how we look for these stories of untold, how we pull out these untold stories from history. And so I'm going to change the topic a moment to say that it could be in the archive, but not labeled as such. And so again, that's something that I've done in my work. For example, my first film, I worked with two directors making a film about Bayard Rustin. And he was a very unknown civil rights activist in the American history. He was an advisor to Dr. Martin Luther King. He was a nonviolent activist following nonviolence in Gandhi. And he was most famous for organizing the March on Washington in 1963. So we were making a film about him, and everybody said, good luck finding any footage, because you can't make a film without any footage or audio. And it was a 4-year process. Did it go out? It was a 4-year process of documenting his life, where he was at what time, and then looking, if I know, I found very boring things. I read meeting minutes because he was an activist, so they had detailed notes on where they were protesting City Hall. And then I went to the New York Municipal Archives and I looked at that date every day in that week and found footage of a protest in front of City Hall. And it just said, Negro and white people protesting City Hall. So it's also about the metadata, and then trying to figure out, could my main character, my subject be there? And then spending the time to look at these archives. And I found him protesting City Hall, right? So that's 10 seconds of our 90-minute film, and everything had to happen in that way. There was another case where he protested a nuclear test in sub-Saharan Africa. It was a French test, and in Ghana. And so at that time in 1956, there was only one state television. So I know that they must have the, because I had read in his notes, his diaries, that it was all over the press in Africa. So I have to think about who was the press in Africa. And then thinking Ghana had only one state television. Where is that television? So now it's owned by a private company. And then writing to them. So this is a lengthy process of research, and I'm a filmmaker. But this is, you know, but when you find something, and when the archivist became intrigued by our story, 6 months later they sent a FedEx package. I thought they'd forgotten about it, but they kept looking, and they found footage of him on top of a truck protesting the French nuclear test in Ghana. And so he wasn't labeled on that film reel. It's also about, you know, looking at the archives with this kind of investigative reporting attitude, you know, perspective.
So, what both of you are saying.
It still doesn't work.
I think everyone's.
No.
Can you hear us in the back?
We can, but you need to stay there.
Is there anybody who needs translation?
Yeah, there are ladies.
There are. Okay. We'll keep working on it.
But some audience members say they
Okay. No, it's okay. So what both of you said, I remember another project from Sweden, Every Face Has a Name, and it was about the moment when the survivors of Auschwitz came to Malmö. And the author decided to search every face and try to find the names of those people. As you have said, information today, but if you give them the personality, the emotion, the story behind it, what we have seen here, is that you can make alive the story much more powerful than the footage itself. It seems something which we also experience when we watch this film today.
Definitely. I would say we need a story in order to get the fact, the history behind the story. Education and cinema and documentary films, they help tremendously in this regard. I can remind ourselves that during our socialist past, was very important that we had the institution of making documentary films, Vreme. And many of these people who worked there were so courageous and so talented, so they were successful to keep their voice and to communicate their ideas through the power of cinema and documentary. They were extremely good, and they were very often in troubles for doing that, especially in such powerful way. And I mean, they were very talented. So when you have a film like this, which is able to raise your attention through emotions to the story, because there is no story, there are a couple of faces. There is a absolutely unknown town and people who are just a couple of them, and through this film you create a story. You can go into individual life, as Remarque says, death of millions is statistics, the death of a single person is that you can, well, that touches you emotionally. So the great success of this particular film, which we just saw, is exactly in this field. It succeeds to get into the individual story. Every one of us can imagine ourselves, our relatives, people who would have relationships with others. We stare at pictures of the past and we are asking, who's that person, how this person is related to the other one. Memory matters. We live shortly on the earth, but we are part of a constant chain, and we come after other people. Some were very famous, some were scientists, producers, some didn't succeed to leave their names to be memorized in textbooks, but everyone was important to have good family, happy people, to have moments that matter. So to be able to address attention of every next generation to any past, connecting this past to our current is a very important job, I believe. So I think that this time we spend together now, thinking of what we just saw, we can be very helpful for the communication of these results, because they need not only to become part of the enormous space of internet, but in order to get attention of new generations, not only to go here and there and to jump finally into pure propaganda that tries to keep us against each other, that to tell it didn't happen exactly that way. Actually, these were not 6 million. It was less. It is not actually right data. It is exaggerated. And there are powerful people in the web who would use for brainwash and for working dirty job for distortion of the memory. And just the opposite to this, we can see that there are decent, emotional, so important results. So we have to be able to communicate this in the right way and to attach attention of teachers, of school guys, of students, just to spend a couple of minutes to talk about, to experience, to feel, and this, I believe, will become better people after all.
I just want to add to what you're saying about how this one film can become a story that we all relate to, and that's the brilliance of the filmmaker, Bianca, that she's taken us through many layers of looking at the same thing, and it kind of made me think of all the things I didn't notice the first 3 minutes, like the cane moving. I don't know if you noticed that. I didn't even notice it. And then I was like, it's making you aware of who the person is who shot this film. And then the fact that he didn't know the names of any of the girls is starting to help you understand the culture of this Jewish community and the segregation of boys and girls. And then the buttons. It just becomes more and more interesting as you go further into, as you watch the film, that then you understand that they had a button factory, and that leads to this very mischievous story, which is, you know, everybody has some, either a child or a relative, that we have these mischievous stories in our family, and it becomes more and more relatable. So by the end of the film, I'm not looking at them as strangers, I'm looking at them as a community, and that they all are brothers, and some of them are brothers and sisters, and some of them married each other later, and some of them, you know, all within the sense that this is also leading to a tragedy. But what happened before that is that they became my family, right, through this process of telling me more about their lives.
And something very important to add to all that, in order to be able to produce these films, again back to archives and footages, because this is our topic. To have archives as a working institution, publicly open, is so important. And it seems to me easy to say, but even nowadays we can see archives that would not be that friendly to their audiences. So we were, from my experience, I can say here that since the first moment I went to the archives, I met professionals who were so helpful, and those people helped throughout years so many different researchers, movie makers, so to make their work easier and also to serve their great duty to keep history the way it was. And I feel like mentioning the name of a colleague from the archives, Vanya Gizenko, having in mind a Holocaust memory, who helped as a consultant many different movies. And sometimes after that she was disappointed when she realized the way film was not done in the way you would expect. And then having the other experience, very positive one when it is successful. So we have to recognize here that we have both footages preserved, institutions that were helpful. These filmmakers went through a tremendous experience of recovering, of researching, And it took such a long time, and we all now have the pleasure to experience this really important and very, very good result.
I think it's almost like you don't need a moderator. They're like no, but I'm asking one thing which I would like also to address is that sometimes using archives also pose the question of ethical way of using the archives, and it seems as times are changing. These same archives can be used by those who will make everything to relativize and say, okay, but you know, okay, you can see these 3 minutes, but listen how beautiful houses out there, you know, they had a beautiful life. So they can use the same picture and put it in totally different context. We can talk about also using the archive of today's, especially, you know, we were talking about Black Lives Matter's situation when you take something which was even not cinematography, it was, you know, from this taken, and then how is responsibility on you when you take it and use it in something which is film?
Well, it's one of the most difficult questions to raise. We have both. We have decent people and we have people who, I don't know what kind of objectives they have, but we all are aware of all that. So that's why it is not just the information is over there, films are over there, go and see, go and read. That's why you need educators, you need teachers, you need moderators, you need university professors. So to have the appropriate context to ask questions and to have as a result people who think, not people who repeat. So it's not something to indoctrinate, but to bring the objective basis of information of real life emotionally and to provoke a real reflection. So that's why the ethics, the morality and the responsibility of educators is so important. Otherwise, we can say memory does not exist. We can lie about history in so many ways that we can produce different reality today. And it happens on so many other issues. And this is a huge challenge. It cannot be finalized. It's a process. And that's why we are all here. And when we have film like this, it supports because it gives us opportunity to talk about the real life based on objective data, emotionally, and to keep thinking.
I want to just add to that in a way that it's also about, as a filmmaker, having a kind of a conversation with your audience. You know, as a filmmaker, we're going to present our perspective on the footage that we're showing you. And in this case, she took us on this journey. In other films, let's say we are selecting from the archives what we're presenting to show this story or another story, etc. But I think there's always room for, you know, there's always a chance someone can present to serve their own propaganda or ideology, but it's also about expecting critical thinking from the audience, and that doesn't always happen. Like, this is a big problem in the United States today, the lack of critical thinking when it comes to the news, and it's affecting our politics, right? So our challenge is to speak to that and present, you know, what we are saying is the truth, an objective truth, but really, what is that? It involves three people. It's the creator of the news, and then it's also the viewer of the news. So it's also about a ongoing conversation so that audiences can talk about what they're seeing in the form of it, and not just as a story that we take for granted as truth. So this came up recently in a film that used AI to you know, you may have heard about the documentary about Anthony Bourdain, the chef who died recently. And there was a documentary made about him, and the filmmaker used artificial intelligence to voice an email that he had written. So it is true that he had written the email, but what was not true that he hadn't spoken that email. So that audio was sounded like him using AI. So now that became a big controversy, and some people were like, well, it was based on truth. And what's the difference between that or using an actor? And then some would say, well, he should have revealed that it was AI, and then the audience would have trusted. So this is all leading to like trust with the audience, a conversation about that. And my personal opinion is to be as transparent as possible about the form of the film. I don't want you to think about, you know, the frames and that I had to edit. I want you to stay in the story as a viewer, but I also don't want you to ever lose trust with me, right? So if there's a moment, in our film about Bayard Rustin, there was FBI reports that we had 25 boxes of FBI reports because he was under surveillance as a civil rights activist. And so we brought those to life with an actor. And every time that happened, you would see the chyron at the bottom of the screen that said, you know, voice of Bayard Rustin by actor, you know, etc. It wasn't that long. I don't exactly remember the exact words, but it was identified so that you would remain in the story and not think about it, but you never lost your trust because it sounds different from his voice. So form and function and experience are all related. And it's like a pact between the filmmaker and the audiences.
It's the same. Now the question when we had a discussion dealing with the past in Sarajevo is that when you have a great trust and an opportunity, when you were given, especially in the war, if you are given the shooting which are made during the especially atrocities, war crimes, and then to keep author, or hoping that the author will know when to stop, when not to show every frame, because he believes that this is film, this is excellent, this is great. And it's actually life. And I think that also decision, and what is your opinion on it, when we have that kind of, let's say, exclusive archives or shooting, when is the border to say that life is, for me, important more than film?
Can I speak to that just briefly? Thank you for that. I think in this case you're talking about also people who are still alive and or their descendants. So that sense of responsibility has to come from the creator as well. As if I show this very graphic footage, are we going to relive the trauma? And or is it so valuable that we have to see it because nobody believes it? And so these are kinds of questions as filmmakers we ask all the time when we're dealing with a sensitive topic. I haven't made a film about the Holocaust, so I can only speak to my own experience. I did work on a film about the killing of Mike Brown in 2014. He was a black teenager in Ferguson, Missouri, killed by a cop, a police officer. It led to the birth of the Black Lives Matter movement, and I worked with these two filmmakers who made a film called Whose Streets, and they followed the first 6 weeks, which was very violent and very angry, and showed us what happened in that 6 weeks in the black community in Ferguson, Missouri, and how that led to the birth of the Black Lives Matter movement. But it's really about those first weeks. And reclaiming, and because my filmmaker wasn't there the first 2 weeks of those 6 weeks, that was when everything was happening, and it was on every single news program in the United States at 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, 10 o'clock, all day long. And we really wanted to find footage. What we did is scoured the internet and reached out to people. So we called this term citizen journalists. So they were documenting what happened and uploading it almost live on YouTube. And it was my job to find some of those people request permission. So this is where it gets into these ethical questions, and explain what we're doing. So we're making a film that will have wide mainstream release. The credit is going to go to my 2 directors. It's not going to go to this person who shot the footage. So it's also about giving credit, and also how we're going to use it, because people are very violent in these videos, and but they're also having violence impact on them, like tear gassed. They're getting tear gassed and shot at. So it's an incredibly traumatic visual material, and the way we managed it was really creating a sense of community amongst all of the content contributors and all what we're calling citizen journalists in this case, and also paying everyone equally. So they're documenting, they're going to be contributing to this. It's a documentary, but technically it's also a product in the marketplace, so someone will benefit from that, and to give equal value to all of our creators. There were 1 or 2 exceptions, because there were some that were actually cinematographers. They weren't just citizen journalists, so we used more footage from them. But transparent, it always comes back to me in terms of being transparent about your intentions, and then also transparent about the money and the process of our filmmaking. And that's worked, but it works when you have people that are alive and that you're negotiating.
Yeah.
I have 3 things to this question. First, I think that the issue of sensation is always beyond. It strives for attention, but actually the attention would be given not because of the sensation, but because of the deeper level of it. So this is one, and it is very unethical, and it's a big issue nowadays. Second, your question reminded me piece of interview of Bernardo Bertolucci, who says that his best political movie is maybe a movie which doesn't speak about politics, but about wind and different types of wind. So the real stories and the big power of movies is not when you speak directly and you try to shock, but when you are a great creator and you can get hearts and emotions, and it is not because you are shocked on the surface of your spontaneous reaction. And the third most important thing I feel like saying is that every good story, movie, anything we produce, I believe is something that will raise questions, not give answers. To provoke thinking, further reflection, looking for more information, to become partner with authors of the product. So one of issues that was raised by this film, not directly, but actually we can come again and again. What happened to these people? So it speaks of life, but it speaks of life through disappearance of these people. So to speak of people who were rescued, and it covers a couple of stories, actually why somebody has to go and rescue somebody, because it was there was persecution. What kind of? So we can start looking for the general picture. We cannot have a picture that speaks only of one side. You have an awful process when people do this to other people, and it provokes, it challenges, and you see the whole different types of behavior. People who will be afraid, people who of helping, or other people who risk their lives and they lost their lives because they were helping, and people who try to make a fortune out of that. So you see all different characters, people who will go with the strong, with those who are powerful of the day. So they want from us, we help them. You go through these documents and you see everything. And here you have in like 20, 30 minutes, I even didn't pay attention how long the film was. You have all these issues, and this very important one, that the story covers objectively what happened. It doesn't create artificial reality out of history.
Yeah, we are coming to the time of your questions, and before that I just wanted to share my experience when you reminded me when you talked about Bertolucci and how you talk about something with different tools. I remember that with my second film, Mila Seeking Senida, about the children who were in a way stolen in eastern Bosnia by the Serb army and supposedly given to the adoption in Serbia to have that kind of revenge to the Turkish Muslim people, to raise them as an Orthodox. And then when I was trying to make this film, I was thinking, how can I, because it was a horror. I was with a young editor and he says, we should edit this like a horror movie because it's horror. And then I did something which was controversial and I said, okay, let's try to put out the war totally from the film. And we put it out. And at the end, I believe that, as you were mentioning, the biggest compliment, it was a great success and it had awards in Sarajevo, Leipzig. It was very nicely, it was my like a first international debut. But the greatest compliment I got from the very famous ex-Yugoslavian actor Rada Šerbedžija and Slavko Štimac. They were by a chance in the premiere in the Pula Film Festival, very old ex-Yugoslavian film festival, and they watched, I don't know how they came there. I was like, wow, they're like, you know, Brad Pitt of ex-Yugoslavia. I was like, wow, what are they doing here? And they were sitting on the floor. And they came after the film, and Slavko Štimac told me, you know, this film is the most horrible film about the war in Yugoslavia, and you didn't have the war in it. So that is the way I was hoping it will come at the end. So, any question from the audience? Okay, maybe we can use just because.
Thank you very much. In law school, I did this course called Law, Modernity and the Holocaust, and something we kept talking about was the difference between knowledge and wisdom, and how knowledge of an event is in no way the same as the wisdom of not repeating the past. And I was wondering where you all see the documentary between this, you know, providing knowledge and wisdom, and I would love to hear your reflections on that.
I have a question, ladies first.
In a way, your question is rhetoric, and I think that if I have to really answer, it brings the wisdom that helps to understand facts and information, the knowledge. So I think it brings the wisdom. It gets us there. It gets our emotions. A picture that is built as a puzzle. You have element here, and your attention is always there. So when I say that I think it's very important that it raises questions, this is exactly wisdom, to provoke thinking and reflection. So it's a path to that. So this is my answer.
Yeah, I think I'm set up to, if I say knowledge, then that's not as interesting. But the knowledge is what leads to that, right? Because it's very obvious the way the knowledge is constructed based on the visual evidence. And that evidence is, again, going back to the fact that people deny the Holocaust in this world. So here's evidence, and then all of the research to find survivors are further providing that evidence that leads to our connection to the story. So I want to add connection to the knowledge, wisdom. It's always a triangle, not a duality.
Me, unfortunately, I'm a too cynical guy to believe in wisdom, and I believe that wisdom, we realize that we don't have it as a humanity, as a civilization, and that unfortunately, I will tell you a little story from Croatia. We were one of the refugee nations, and I remember as a kid how we were, in a way, trying to plead to Europe to understand us in which atrocity we are. I remember one lady, she was so old, and she's saying, why can you not understand us? Why, as a humans, after the Second World War, you're not accepting us more easily, more comfortable? And I was like very shocked because of my family and everything what we went through the war. And then 30 years have gone. And then the migrant crisis came. And I was watching my fellow Croatian citizens, what they were doing and how they were approaching to the migrants. They forgot. They forgot that they were illegals, that they were, half of them, refugees, and they are working in Sweden, Scandinavia. And I was pretty much attacked in Croatia because I was stood up towards the human organization to help migrants. And I said, but listen, how come we can have the right, because we're Christians, or Christian society, to go to Sweden and work in black, you know, black money, and go for good life? How come we as a refugee country have generations who are living in Ireland, Sweden, and now we are depriving the same rescue which we're very, you know, proud. I don't know how in Bulgaria, we're very proud, you know, we're the best country in the world. God, in Croatia. And then we are very Christian when the foreigners come and they're, Christ only for us, not for you. Yeah, that's it. So, me, I believe that documentarism makes something which we said we had earlier today, rehearsed for pitching tomorrow, and one of the great also other 7 excellent projects, we talked after and we thought about possible title, and that is Window to the Future. And I believe that documentarism in this kind of story is nothing else but window to the future. If you want to forget, this is what will happen. It's tomorrow, it's not before, it's not yesterday. Thank you. We have, okay.
We don't discuss one particular case. For that reason, I wish from our foreigner guest to briefly briefly systematize the type of usage of the real archive, not yesterday archive as lady said, but the real archive in the documentary, all types of usage of the archives in the documentary. Thank you.
What do you mean real archive?
Real archive, I mean archive that is old one, not as yesterday, not as lady mentioned yesterday archive. Somebody mentioned about BLM that archive is not only 30, 40, whatever years ago, but yesterday is also archive. No, real archive is old one, near forgiven, let's say, which is already revived. So I want to know the usage of types of usage confirm our foreigner guest.
I think he means recent.
Current. The use of current archives.
So you want to know about use of current archive?
No,
or
old one.
Old one. Okay. Sorry.
Real one.
Okay. There is a one old filmmaker who said that the moment you stopped and revived the moment, it's the past. So your archive 30 seconds ago. But it's discussion which we can have later on. But anyway.
My impression was that we speak only about archives of Holocaust in the context of this film. And obviously we speak of history by 1945. And I would encourage everyone in the audience and everywhere to find opportunity and to read documents in the archives. It brings different knowledge and different opportunity to reflect. And fortunately, technology helps for good. So our archives as well, I don't work in the archives, I'm just a researcher and I use them as a researcher. And they started a process of digitalization with a very good search engine, so you can find a lot of not only famous pieces of documents, but hundreds of documents from different periods. You can see them in a perfect quality on your computer. And also there is a, again in the context of Holocaust history, that work that is called EHRI, European Holocaust Research Infrastructure. So they are based on metadata, and they create connection on this technology between many archives. So if somebody is looking for a document of their relatives or particular story, they could be in Bulgaria or Croatia or in the United States or in Japan or Japan, other country, you could find traces that relevant documents are there. So archives are very well structured, and they help researchers to find not only general topics, but very specific documents. So it's a whole universe of history.
I think that answered your question, sir. Is that right?
Maybe you also add something.
I mean, in terms of this topic and the Holocaust, absolutely what you said. That there's a larger community that they're already researching and making connections. So it's about tapping into that. In this film, it's just the use of one piece of film that was shot by a non-professional, like a tourist. And that's what's also brilliant about it. And then reaching out to the researchers, like for the understanding of clothing, she reached out to a clothing designer, what was the word? A wardrobe specialist, who was a historian. So it comes back to that kind of expertise and looking at the visual reference to uncover a history of this town. In my work, it's very, we're working with corporate archives. Like I will just back up, everything that I didn't shoot myself, I consider archival. Because I will have to license it from the owner of that footage. So I often work with large media archives like Getty Images or ABC in the States. The three main television stations for a long time was ABC, NBC, CBS. So every country will have their different history of ownership of these television archives. So that's always a great place to start. And then I also always encourage people I'm working with to think beyond the mainstream archive and who else might be preserving history, so individual families that are relevant to your story. Everything they have, like documentation, their house deed for purchase of a house is an archival piece of material, if it's relevant to your story. All of that provides evidence of lives lived. And power structures, and there's a story behind it. Like how old were they when they bought their first house? Now I'm just going down a rabbit hole. But I hope that answers your question.
Okay, but thank you for that question, because it was something which I didn't want to ask, but at the end, both of you, what is your opinion? About, you mentioned the ownership of the archives. There is a dispute in ex-Yugoslavia, I don't know how it is in Eastern Europe further, about those archives made by the public television, paid by the owner of, and that is the citizens of these countries. And that is that today, okay, for technical preservation, digitalization, it's understandable that you should pay some fee. But the ownership in a sense of something which was made by the public institution, should it be, because you mentioned in the beginning that it's important that archives should be free. And if you put a commercial price on it, then it's not achievable.
Well, organization and keeping rights is a different issue. So as far as access is concerned, I'm sure it should be publicly accessible, and people have to be supported. Being researchers, so just people feel like reading these pieces. But as far as we live in the material world, and archives have to support them to have funds, and so they apply for projects, they have good equipment to digitalize more and more documents. To keep these documents also in a good quality, they are supported by state budget and so on. But their fees is, but these are, I would say, symbolic fees, like a couple of leva to have like access to archives, so it's nothing. And no, these are not done. This is just the, anyway, small, these are just rules. But if something goes to commercial, and if it has budget for using these footages and archival documents for commercial use, then they have, prior to that, prices for this and that. So I think it is the way the work is organized all over the world. But the biggest issue is whether the archives are open, and they shouldn't hide documents because there is information that is, you know, not really very pleasant one. So archives, and this is the case I experienced here, they are not keeper of specific image of the past, they just keep the past. And in good quality, accessible to everyone.
So you're making an assumption or a statement that archives should be apolitical. And I think that's, that would be the dream. And then they should also be openly accessible to any researcher, and that would be the dream. Then the question is, do we have, since I'm creating a documentary, which is considered a commercial product, what is the appropriate amount to pay? And that appropriate amount changes with time. You know, at the very beginning of my career, archival documentaries were only for the nerdiest of the nerds, you know, and the history buffs. And so all of these archives, ABC, Getty Images, those are two very different kinds of archives. The fees for an independent filmmaker were much lower than today. They're becoming more expensive. One could say because they're becoming aware of the corporate value of their archives, or you could say because there's an influx of money that's going into the documentary world in the United States, and when they see that you're a Netflix documentary or a large budget, they want to make money from it because they are for-profit institutions like Getty, right? So it's become a challenge for us in the States that archives are now very expensive. So what does that mean for an independent filmmaker who's trying to speak truth to power with their film? You know, and so what you're raising is really the need for us to value our archives and have this kind of conversation about the law and like who has the right to access these archives, and then who has the right to like charge money for it. In the United States, we have the National Archives, which includes presidential libraries and also just the repository of the US government. Not all of public television is there because public television is funded by taxes, but it's not owned by, it's not in the National Archives. But I will say that the National Archives, I've been doing research there this past summer, and it is incredible that I'm working on a story that is about a political campaign that exposes an American World War II hero as a racist, and nobody denied me access to this material because I, as a US citizen or anybody, has a right to go into that library and access whatever box I find. There was no attempt to hide this. And the librarians have been amazing at helping me find what they know I'm looking for. So that's a rare thing that was established by law, that we have access to anything created or preserved by the US government. And so that just raises the importance of having these conversations in countries where I was on a panel at Doc Leipzig once with a filmmaker from Romania, where there's a big question of privatizing archives post independence, and then if it's privatized, then there's benefits and values of keeping it owned by the public, or by the government, or by the private, right? There are values, and there's value in both, but what does that mean in terms of access and then ability to work with that footage? So again, I always want to throw it back to like, this is just something that needs to be more transparent so people know, and then they might fight for the preservation of these archives and having that access remain open, because it's not always open. We also have another thing in the United States that we call fair use, and that's also a law. So as we use that law, we are basing it on the First Amendment right to free speech, that let's say there's a piece of archival that you don't own the copyright to, you have a right to use it if it's integrally important to making the case in point in your film, and then you don't have to pay. But you work with a lawyer to document why you're using all of this footage without paying the copyright owner. So, and that's because, like, for example, if I want to critique NBC News for being misogynist, or, then they would never let me use that footage. But I need that footage to show to you that for the past decade, this one reporter regularly says misogynist things. So I have a right, again, it comes back to like the law and like this public discussion that's my right.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I don't know how it is in Bulgaria, but in Croatia you cannot do that. We have a situation where I'm helping one documentary production, which they want to talk about one of the owner of one news group in ex-Yugoslavia, and the only available footage of him is made by his news. And we are already told that if we are using it, we will be sued not by the criminal law, but the copyright law.
Right.
And unfortunately, in Croatia, that's possible.
As far as there is different documents, different archives, depending on the period, have different status. So when it's history, it's history. And the context of my point was, in a way, transition happened here, because the previous political regime by 1989 would have regulations of the access itself. And since the very beginning, after the changes, it was done so the archives are free, open and transparent and public. So if you're a researcher, you go and you research. And now having this process of digitalization, you could read these documents from it's in the web. Publicly accessible, so even you don't need to register in order to start reading and looking for documents. So it's a very good situation and very helpful. So go and research.
Yeah.
So I think that if there's any other question, okay, you have one more.
Thank you. So my question is, it's one that I've been personally asking myself, and the film we just watched bring it back to memory. And it's when one makes a documentary film, whose film it is, whose story it is. Not legally. I mean more so ethically, because yes, the filmmaker has made the film itself, but the story has existed before the filmmaker. And it's just an ethical question that I would like to pose to you.
So, if I may, because in University of Zagreb, I have that collegium talking about documentarism, and I had the same question from my students. And I don't know if you noticed at the end, the credits of this film. It was very well written who is the author of the 3 minutes. So that is his film, of course. But if you talk about further research, contextualization, and effort of using and explaining that video, then it is a film of director. She has made the further contextualization of that archive. And I think that there is no any ethical problem, because she has done in a very transparent way. She used the grandson who said, "This is my grandfather film," and at the end the credit begins with him, not with her. She's the last. I don't know if you agree.
Completely agree, and this is the case of anything we produce, a book, documentary book, so of course it is based on previous researches. That's why when we write a book we quote, and we refer to those who concluded something, so not the particular sentence but even the whole idea. And thus we bring forward, if you don't mind, the civilization, so we refer to each other. Otherwise, if we keep everything in a separate single cloud as a piece of information or footage, then we won't have stories and we won't have attention to them. So I completely agree with what was said, and that's why the ethics of authors is so important, to refer in the appropriate way, and it is clear what is what.
Yeah, and I think otherwise we wouldn't have the ability to make films about our history with a new perspective. And so taking this another level further, if you're denied that access, there's always a way, and that's what we do as creative individuals. It could be as crazy as somebody just describing the footage that they're not allowed to use, or using animation, and I think that's like the beauty of the creative spirit, is we'll always find our way to make our voice heard, right? But this is such a great conversation just to reveal all the inner workings of like what we're up against, right?
Great question.
Yeah, it's a great question.
And also, if I may, the responsibility of the recreation of the context, because this is also a very important part of the general result. So it's a big issue, really. Great question, thank you.
Okay, so if we don't have any other question, I must thank you very much for your beautiful talk, and I think it was great. Thank you. Great audience.
We have to thank our hosts,
Yes.
both institutions, because we are all brought here because of you, Martichka, and the whole institution of State Institution of Culture in the Foreign Ministry. So this is what we do, so thank you for inviting us.
Thank you all.